a Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, or a Knight of the Nine Kingdoms if you watched episode 6, or a Knight of Westeros's 9 administrative zones if you want to be technical and accurate based on the book source material, just wrapped its first season, and a lot of people are extraordinarily happy with it, claiming that this somehow refutes wokeness and whatnot, and is just a great example of what happens when you fight against all those left-wing influences, even though that's not necessarily 100% true with this show. In my opinion, the show's fantastic. It's really good. Part of the reason it's so good is that it's a close adaptation of the first book in the Dunk and Egg novellas, The Hedge Knight, and that book happens to be among George's best writing ever. And by the way, I think it's better on its own, the Dunk and Egg novellas, than the actual entire Song of Ice and Fire books. And yeah, when you adapt something that's really good that closely, you end up with good results. And I think this is the actual lesson that you take away from this particular series. And a lot of people who are focusing on the level of wokeness or the lack of wokeness are kind of missing the point of why people enjoyed this adaptation, why people enjoyed the original story. And one of the most obvious and glaring examples of people missing the entire point are those who claim that this show is finally something in the Westeros universe that shows us knights actually being good, when the entire premise of A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, the Hedge Knight book, and the Dunk and Egg novellas is that Sir Duncan the Tall is not a sir. He's not actually a knight. He in fact lied about being a knight, but even though he's a false knight, in terms of the values that he holds and the respect for knights that he has, or at least his vision of knights, he's actually the truest knight among them all. And that's what makes this story so George R. R. Martin-y, because you have a knight that isn't a knight, who is the truest knight, who is being served by a squire who isn't a squire, who happens to be a member of the royal family in disguise. And yes, it has all those subversive elements within the tale. However, the tale is much more simple and streamlined, and I think this is an example of what people actually want to see when it comes to adaptations, which is really close to the book material, especially when the book material is really good, and of course, simpler stories with lower stakes and less convoluted plots when that's what's actually demanded. So this is what we're going to talk about today, but before we do, I want to thank everybody who supports this channel via actualjusticewarrior.com/join.
Give me the money. Give me the money. Okay.
So I don't want to go too much into plot summary for this particular show, but I will say I'm going to give it a hard recommend to you guys out there in the audience right off the top if you want to stop this video right here, because it is in fact really good. And the basic premise of this show is Duncan the Tall, who is a knight that's not a knight, ends up bearing the knight that he served as a squire, and he makes the decision that he is going to present himself as someone who is knighted by Sir Arlen of Pennytree just prior to his death in order to join a tournament, maybe win a joust or two, ransom the armor for some money so that he could live as a hedge knight, or maybe impress a lord that he views to be noble so that he could be brought into that lord's service as a household knight. Again, very simple goal. He's just a regular ordinary guy who grew up poor. He was taken in as a squire by a knight that he respects, and he wants to win the favor of the lords of Westeros so that he can have a better life. He doesn't want to become a robber knight. He doesn't want to sell off the possessions and become a beggar, because that's what he used to be, which we'll find out a little bit later. He just wants to improve his station in life, and that very simple, straightforward, and relatable motivation is what brings him to the tournament at Ashford Meadow, which is where the entire season essentially takes place. Now, along the way, he stops at an inn, he encounters a boy that he assumes to be a stable boy that's not a stable boy, and that person is actually a member of the royal family that is in hiding, avoiding the tournament, but he wants to go to the tournament as it's his brother who decided to be in hiding. So he ends up joining Dunk in that he follows him later on to try to be his squire. So you have a knight that isn't a knight that's being served by a squire that isn't a squire. Anyway, through the machinations of the plot, one of the princes, Aerion, the bad Targaryen, ends up attacking a girl that Dunk is fond of. She is somebody who's actually doing a puppet show. Dunk ends up defending her because a true knight defends the women, defends the poor, defends the vulnerable against vicious attackers. And because he ends up striking the prince during this defense, Dunk is at risk of losing not only the offending hand, but of course the offending leg, which of course will cripple his ability to be a knight going forward, and thus thus ruin his life. So Dunk ends up demanding a trial by combat against the false accusations, or alizations as the Superman would call them.
False alizations and not facts.
By Aryan Brightflame, and Aryan, proving that nobility isn't in fact noble, says that he'll do the trial by combat, but it has to be a trial by 7, which requires Dunk, who has been established to not know very many people and not know very many knights, to find 6 other champions to fight alongside him, as essentially a way for Aryan to win without actually, winning the actual fight, because he does not have a good cause, and he estimates Dunk to be a better fighter than he is due to his size. I mean, he's called Sir Duncan the Tall for a reason. So yeah, this is like the basic premise of the show, and throughout this whole time, Dunk makes friends, he ends up meeting people, there's a little bit of subterfuge and a little bit of people not liking the Targaryens because of their Valyrian traditions and whatnot, so that's all fun and in the background, but for the most part, this is a story of somebody who tried to do the right thing in an evil world, and our hope that he will in fact overcome. Now, could you glean further political messages from this show if you so desired to? Yeah, of course you could. It's George R. R. Martin. George R. R. Martin is a very left-wing guy, but the fact is, at its base component, this is the story of a very likable protagonist who ended up telling a bit of a lie, got himself into a situation that he didn't deserve to be in because he did the right thing, and then we are rooting for him to overcome the corrupt people that are in this situation, that were acting badly, that he was addressing, and fundamentally, this is going to be, if it's well acted and well executed, a very liked and embraced story, and that is exactly what happened. Now, of course, it's also a really good adaptation of what I think is George R. R. Martin's best material. The Dunk and Egg novellas, even though they're not as expansive as the Song of Ice and Fire series, to which the Game of Thrones series is based on, the fact is, as contained stories, they work so wonderfully because they're so simple, contained, and again, they're incredibly well written. Definite recommend for you guys to read them, because even though this is a really good adaptation, there were changes made, and for the most part, those changes did not improve the source material. Like, one of the things that I notice about this show, and a lot of people have complained about it, even though they'll say it's few and far between, is that there is an inordinate amount of like poop jokes and fart jokes that are just inserted at random, and also there's a lot of like Family Guy cutaway humor, and honestly, almost all of that stuff could be cut from the show. And in fact, one of the worst, most egregious examples of this happened in episode 4, where Dunk gives the speech that I absolutely love.
A knight defends the innocent. That's all I did. I was not Sir Erland's blood, but I have followed his example, as your sons will follow yours.
Because it turns out he's short of a knight for his trial by 7, and thus is going to be declared a loser. And there's like moments in this speech and the lead up to this speech that were cut from the book that absolutely needed to be there, like the fact that Duncan ends up showing up to his trial by 7, realizing that there's a massive crowd around to see the trial, and he thinks to himself in the book that these people showed up to watch him die. However, what actually happens, and it's revealed, is that these people showed up because they heard about one of the very few knights that kept his vows, Sir Duncan the Tall, and they showed up to cheer him on. And it's one of the most beautiful scenes in the book, but the thing is, it's not in the show. They just cut it from the show. They have the Steely Pate thing where he agrees to give him the shield for just a copper piece, so just for a penny, but they didn't have the part where all the small folk embrace this guy because they actually do appreciate a knight that lives up to his vows, and that's an absolute shame because what they replaced it with was a fart joke. The Brood of Bracken getting up and farting in the middle of Duncan's speech, which is really unfortunate because in the source material, and while the speech was adapted really well, it's better in the source material, Dunk has been hearing about all the legendary knights that are at this tournament, and rather than having the Brood of Bracken get up, and by the way, you only know he's the Brood of Bracken because of the fact that if you look at the credits, he's labeled as the Brood of Bracken, but he ends up getting up and doing the fart thing in the show, but in the book, Dunk had heard that the Brood of Bracken was here. He had heard about other legendary knights that were present at the tournament, so during the speech, he starts calling them out individually.
Has courage deserted the noble houses of Westeros? I will not believe it is so! and there are no true knights among you!
Because these are the people that he believed to be noble because he can't stop hearing about how noble they are, but they all refuse him one by one because they don't know him or something of the sort, even though they know for a fact that his cause is just, they just don't want to be on the wrong side of the Targaryens. And by the way, this is one of the things that sets up Baelor fighting for Sir Duncan to be the epic moment that it actually was. So I think cutting this from the source material was a big mistake because it makes Baelor's heroics all the more heroic. Now, by the way, Baelor Targaryen, absolutely great. The actor that got to play him was wonderful. And one of the things that I will say that we're missing, though, from this show is a couple of extra scenes that were also cut with him. And honestly, I know there's a lot of people who praise episode 5 to the ends of the earth, but it was actually not my favorite episode. I felt like that 20-minute flashback really broke up the pacing. And if you would have shortened that, then maybe you could have gotten that extra scene with Baelor that would have made the twist at the end of that episode all the more satisfying and devastating for the audience, because in the source material, Baelor actually develops the strategy in order to fight the trial by 7, which actually involves them using tourney lances, which are 12 feet long, but don't have a steel tip blade at the end of it, rather than the combat lances, which are 9 feet long and have those blades, because Baelor doesn't want people to get killed. He just wants to get Aerion and Daeron to yield and withdraw their allegations.
False allegations and not facts.
However, this is all cut from the show, which is really unfortunate because that scene helps us better connect with Baelor. We get to hear how smart he is, how competent he is, and in addition to that, he calms down Sir Duncan the Tall, who we're all worried about because he's our champion that we're riding along with, and that makes us connect more with Baelor, which again ends up setting up for what the result of the trial by 7 is extraordinarily well. Again, I'm not someone who's against all changes from the source material. In fact, they inserted some of the Blackfire stuff into this particular story when in the Hedge Knight was actually written, the Blackfire stuff wasn't actually thought of by George R. R. Martin, so it's suspiciously missing from the Hedge Knight's tale, so that's totally fine with me that they added a little bit of that in there since Sir Arlen is actually connected to one of the Blackfire rebellions, actually the first Blackfire rebellion, so that makes perfect sense because it helps to better set up events for later seasons. But yeah, these particular changes, not exactly my favorite, not a fan of them. And speaking of one of the changes that I'm not a fan of, in the original source material, Egg is allowed to be a squire for Sir Duncan the Tall, but as like a little bit of an end credit joke, for some reason, they let us know that Maekar did not authorize Egg to go with Duncan, which is absurd because what would ultimately end up happening if that were the case is that he would send his household guard to track down and kill Duncan for kidnapping his son, even though he did not kidnap his son. Again, the source material for the show is really good. It is lighthearted. There is comedy in it, and I'm not saying you can't have any comedy, but when the comedy undercuts the story, maybe get rid of that. When the comedy is pointless, stupid poop jokes, maybe get rid of that as well, because it just didn't need to be there. And again, those particular changes did make this worse, although it's still a very good show, and I hope you guys are looking forward to season 2. Now, as far as the lesson on whether or not this kills woke or anything of the sort, honestly, that's a conversation I'm not all that interested in. I think the actual lesson of A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms is that if you have A+ source material, then adapt it properly. Adapt it as closely as you can. Only make changes that are better suited for the change in medium, and then you'll be alright, and then people will support your series. Because that's what happened right here, and in general, it's not necessarily the wokeness versus the non-wokeness in adaptations. In general, it's bad writing, bad story construction, and trying to put your own messages into the narrative that end up conflicting with the very story that you're trying to tell, because part of it is based on the source material, which may not necessarily carry that original message. But you know what? Those are just my thoughts. I want to know what you guys think down in the comments below. As per usual, if you like the video, show them by leaving a like, subscribe for more content, follow me on the social media, support me via support links in the description of this video. This has been me talking about A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, or 9 Kingdoms, or 9 administrative zones. Till next time.